here with Amara and Rachel, the authors of Tailoring DBT for Autistic Clients. And I'm so excited to talk about this new publication that's out because I personally read the book and I think that this is a book for clinicians. Like, yes, the DBT is tailored, but I'm a DBT clinician. I don't specialize in autism, and it was super helpful for me to assess and conceptualize the cases that I already have, even my non-DBT cases. So I'm super excited to dive into some of the highlights of this book. So let me first let Amara and Rachel introduce themselves, and then we will jump into some of the pieces of the book and the inspiration behind it.
Thank you so much, Kim, for having us in this conversation. We are super excited to share about this work and this topic that we're so passionate about. So I'm a psychologist. I'm physically based in Nevada. I am a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry and psychology at University of Nevada, Reno, and also run a private practice, Flow Psychological Services, and provide neuroaffirming assessment and therapy to folks in California and all, I think now 44 SIPAC states. Yeah, I am bring lived experience as an autistic ADHDer myself, and also as the parent and a spouse of folks with a similar neurotype, as well as a lot of clinical experience over a good number of years. So hand it over to Rachel.
Rachel, I'm a clinical social worker physically located between DC and Baltimore in Maryland. I run a small private practice where I see clients doing DBT-informed work. I also do consultation and supervision locally, nationally, and internationally. And now I'm proud to say I'm joining the inaugural doctoral social work class at the University of Maryland. So I'll be going into that in August.
Okay, well, let's start with what was the inspiration behind writing this book for the two of you?
So there's a few things. One of them is just working with clients where DBT has been moderately helpful, especially our autistic clients, but it also in other ways it reinforced shame. Because it didn't account for their neurotype, for how they were put together and moved through the world. And in working with these clients, with using the skills in a tailored way in the context of their neurotype, it really made sense to them. And they were able to access skills that they weren't otherwise able to access. Also, with that understanding of how they operate in the world, it can be a healing experience for them just to have those conversations. Additionally, when Amara and I met, and we had a couple other autistic clinicians, we realized that all of us were doing very similar tailoring to the skills. We were teaching in very similar ways and just intuitively in ways that other clinicians weren't. And we're like, we need to put this together and get it out there. And then Amara, the last piece.
Yeah, so I think the other part of it is we met and we started doing trainings and we started responding to lots of people's questions on the DBT-L listserv and other online forums. And people just kept asking us, how can we learn more about this? How can we really understand what you're saying? It's so much. And so we realized that this work needed to be more accessible, right? There needed to be something enduring that people could really dig into and reference over time. So we first created an asynchronous training for folks, but as well as obviously writing this book. So we hope that folks will find it really helpful and all the things that Rachel just talked about.
The community is very fortunate to have this publication out there. So thank you. And so we're not going to be giving away the book, even though we could sit here for 3 hours and give away the book because it's so interesting to talk about. We're not going to be giving it away. But if you can speak to what makes this book different than other books on autism, other even clinical books on autism.
Yeah, so I would say, did you want to jump in, Rachel?
So in this book, we're not just talking about practice, but we're also talking about the principles behind it. We give some concrete guidance on how to tailor the DBT skills, many to be more in alignment with universal design. We're also giving theoretical pieces behind why we're tailoring, these ways, and freedom to tailor for each client uniquely rather than falling back on a one size fits all for autism.
Yeah, I would say also compared to the general body of books on how to understand and work with autistic people, ours is very neuroaffirming, which is not true for a lot of, especially older books on how to work with autistic folks. Many times autism has been viewed in a very stigmatized way and been approached with a how can we get rid of this thing and make these people more normal type approach, which is not neuroaffirming. And so one thing that is very different about our book is that it is neuroaffirming and written based on lived experience as well as clinical and research experience. And I think compared to the other thing, compared to other neuroaffirming books about autism, is we're very much grounded in both, quality training and research in this therapy that has been helpful, but also, unfortunately, at times probably done some harm to folks. And so we really bring this very deep understanding, both clinically and from a research perspective and from lived experience in this scientifically supported therapy and how that could be better for autistic folks. And I think there's a small amount of overlap between the sort of CBT, DBT world and neuroaffirming perspective. And so this is a step in the direction of sort of bringing those things together. I think compared to other DBT books, obviously, it's much more about how to tailor for autistic folks, and that's not something that's my knowledge is a big feature of other books about DBT. There is a workbook related to that, but it's not similar to our book in that it's not a sort of a comprehensive guide for clinicians.
And so that sort of goes into one of the topics that I just wanted to highlight, and that's ableism. So you talk about ableism in the book. Can you give us just a bit of background on that and how you integrated that piece into the book? Because that was a piece that's one of the many pieces that really stood out for me.
Right. Well, I think like other isms that people may be familiar with, ableism is the idea that there is one correct way to be, to act, to develop, and that everybody should be able to, and that should hopefully will raise a red flag for anybody who has any background in CBT or DBT, because we know it doesn't help mental health. It's the idea that people should be able to do certain things on a certain timeline in a certain way, and that is the correct way, and that the goal is to make everybody able to do those things in that way, right? Versus valuing diversity and maybe accepting that people develop on different timelines in different ways, have different strengths, have different challenges. So that's basically the crux of ableism, and it leads to a lot of discrimination and prejudice against people who do not fit that ableist norm. Whereas if we can take more of a diversity affirming view, then we say, okay, people develop differently. We can accept that.
And I think you even I think there's an example in the book about the lighting in a room. And as opposed to assuming that this is the way everybody's lighting should be, so I think even in the book, you give like very concrete examples of what this looks like in practice, right? As opposed to it being more from a clinical lens, which there's examples of like how this actually would play out in anybody's office.
Right, right. And a lot of these things are even culturally constrained, but there's social norms about them in particular cultures. Like eye contact is a great example when we think about autistic folks. Western cultures generally value a lot of eye contact and may even interpret a lack of eye contact as a sign of dishonesty or deceit. That is not the same in East Asian cultures. And even folks from East Asian descent have often been judged for not making as much eye contact, just as autistic folks have been judged for not making as much eye contact or making it in a different way. So these are the ideas that these things that a lot of people just see as, well, that's how it is, are actually really culturally bound. And we don't necessarily have to accept, although we can't just wave a magic wand and change the whole world, but we don't necessarily have to accept that the way that a lot of people do it is the only correct or okay way to do it.
Yeah.
And Kim, it's interesting you bring up the idea of the lighting and how much ableism is structurally, or almost assumptions are structurally built even into our language. I think that example was also used as an example of even the language we're using. Instead of, if the light is too bright for you, you can turn it down this way. It's, go ahead and use the dimmer switch and get the light to the perfect place for you, or something similar to that, where we're not normalizing a certain brightness and then saying, but if it's too much for you, it's go ahead and adjust it to whatever makes sense.
Yeah. And that's another, like, in a different subject, but another piece is that you highlight in here a lot about the language and like the importance of the language. And even, can you speak a little bit about the person versus identity language? Because that was another piece that for me as a experienced clinician that doesn't specialize in autism, that was a new concept for me. That was something that I was not, was not something that was in my awareness.
Yeah. So a few decades ago, some well-meaning folks came up with the idea that if somebody had a stigmatized characteristic or a diagnosis, that we didn't want to make it sound like that was the entire person. So, for example, I'm not saying that I consider this a bad thing per se, but they, instead of saying like schizophrenic to refer to a person with schizophrenia, they would say them as a person with schizophrenia, right? So that is person first language, right? The idea is that this is a negatively perceived thing, and we don't want to make it sound like that's the whole person. So we're going to say person with this thing rather than this type of person, right? And a lot of actually the preference in the majority of the autistic community is instead for identity first language. And that is basically reclaiming the autistic identity, reclaiming autism, and not accepting that it's some bad stigmatized thing. I mean, some people may view it that way, and we can't change that. But at the same time, we're saying, calling someone an autistic person or autistic researcher or autistic whatever, right? We're sort of reclaiming that thing that was viewed as negative instead as something that we're owning as part of ourselves. And truly, autism affects every aspect of our experience, from biological, sensory, social, communication. And so it really makes sense that just like for other identities, we'd say like African American woman or something like that, that we would include that as part of our identities. Now, not every person has to embrace autism as part of their identity, not every autistic person, and we always want to defer to whatever the client prefers. But by default, it's more respectful to go with the preference of the majority of the autistic community. And that's based on research, by the way, not just my opinion, which would be autistic person versus person with autism or person with ASD, which also is problematic because then it's sort of highlighting the disorder part, which also sort of implies that it's a negative thing. So even though that is the official DSM diagnosis.
So this really leans into the next piece that you touched on a little bit, but I would love it if we could touch on a little bit more on just the concept of neurohumility and just how that is really interwoven throughout this publication.
So we define neurohumility as an extension of cultural humility, where we constantly have to remember that the way we see, perceive, understand, conceptualize the world can be fundamentally different from the people around us. So when we think about therapy, it's inherently hierarchical. There's a power imbalance. And even though we have this DBT assumption about therapy, that the therapeutic relationship between clients and clinicians is a relationship between equals, oftentimes based on the structure, clients don't experience that. And especially when we have clients who've been told their whole lives that their way of experiencing the world is inherently wrong, different in a way that they are responsible for fixing. And then we have these clients coming up to us for answers. How do I do this right? As if we're the expert, right? Mm-hmm. So we first need to equalize and proactively equalize to actually help our clients. We need to make sure they know that I cut this part. I'm going to unfocus myself. Sorry about that. So, okay. So basically, we're proactively equalizing to actually help them. They need to know that we not only actually believe their perception of the world is their reality, instead of defaulting to our own perception. So when we talk about, again, the brightness of the lighting, we're not defaulting to this is typical and you can do whatever you'd like, but just adjust it to whatever feels right, right? And we can convey this through our language, which I just talked about a little bit. And we talk more about in how to do that effectively in the book. And it's when our clients feel believed, that's when we can really authentically partner with them to navigate this world that's not necessarily designed for their way of naturally moving through it.
Yeah, I think that part is and that's where I think there's so many pieces of this book that goes beyond being a DBT clinician, right? Like that concept is not a DBT concept.
Totally. Yeah.
Right.
And I would say
And so,
neurohumility is sorry to jump
no,
in,
go
but
ahead.
neurohumility is grounded in an increasingly large body of research on the critical role of cultural humility in therapy. And this is a specific type of cultural humility for neurodivergent folks. But I think it's really important to realize that there's actually a good body of research that's developing showing that neurohumility helps the therapeutic alliance, helps the therapeutic relationship recover from therapist mistakes, and it is related to better outcomes in therapy. So there's a lot of good evidence that cultural humility, of which neurohumility is a specific type, is actually really essential in therapy.
So what does this look like in practice? So let's talk a little bit about the practical piece of this and what this actually looks like. And in that we'll talk about the ascent model that is really a pillar to this work.
Yeah. So we were, give a little backstory. We were doing all these trainings and talking about the things that needed to be, done to make DBT better for autistic clients. And people were, really finding that helpful, but also having a hard time remembering all the different things. And so as we were in this process, we came up with an acronym to help people remember the ways to tailor DBT and honestly other therapies as well for autistic clients. So the acronym is ASCENT. We also like that DBT's general goal is to help people kind of accomplish or ascend toward their life worth living goals, and that is true for autistic clients as well. And I think just having the model have that name is a wonderful reminder that this is what we're trying to do with autistic clients as well. We're helping them build their life worth living, not sort of getting rid of or fixing autism or some kind of ableist goal like that. So I'll give you just a real brief overview of the model. So basically there's some big picture things, and then there's more specific things that involve adjusting for the differences in autistic clients. So the A in the ASCENT model is for autonomy supporting and affirming goal setting. A lot of times it's assumed that if somebody is autistic, that the goal is to get rid of or minimize or change their autism, and that would not be autistic affirming goal assumption. Also, many autistic people have very often been told how they should do things, what they should want, and all that kind of stuff, rather than actually respecting their autonomy in deciding what their goals are in therapy. And other clients in DBT or other therapies, of course, we would want to guide therapy based on what they are trying to accomplish in therapy, right? We'd want to respect their autonomy. And so we definitely want to do that for autistic clients as well. So that's the first is autonomy supporting and affirming goal setting right off the bat to make sure that we're actually aiming therapy in a way that is neuroaffirming and autonomy supporting for the client. The other two big picture things are neurohumility, which Rachel said a bit about before, which is a special kind of cultural humility for neurodivergent folks, realizing that there's as a therapist a lot that you don't know, even if you share the client's neurotype, that your experience is probably different than their experience. And so if we come in with an attitude of curiosity and being open to correction, and then we are going to be much more likely to really understand the client's experience rather than, assuming that they're like every other autistic client or every other DBT client, right? So that's neurohumility, very crucial. And then being trauma informed, that's the T in the ASCENT model. So autistic people typically have a lot of trauma history, especially social and relational trauma, history of being manipulated by other people, history of, of communication misunderstandings in both directions, which is sometimes referred to as the double empathy problem, where autistic folks maybe understand non-autistic people's communication in a different way than intended, and the reverse is also true. So non-autistic people often misunderstand autistic people's communication. So in any case, we have a lot of trauma history, and therapy is a relationship, right? If somebody's got a lot of relational trauma history, then we need to be very aware of that and very mindful of not reactivating that trauma, not, having therapist created trauma, which unfortunately can be a thing if the therapist doesn't understand the client and doesn't realize that they don't understand the client and does inappropriate things in therapy. So those are the three big picture things. So there's the autonomy affirming and autonomy supporting an autistic affirming goal setting, neurohumility, and being trauma informed. And then the S, C, and the E in ASCENT are tailoring for specific differences in autistic clients and specific needs that we have. So the S, the S actually stands for 4 things. So we cheat a little bit with that one. Stands for accommodating for sensory differences. Autistic people may experience some sensations as more intense than other people do. Like that would be like a sensory sensitivity, or they may be hyposensitive in the sense that they're not as, that they don't recognize some sensations in the way that other people do. Differences in interoceptive awareness of sensations inside of our bodies are very common for autistic people. So one is accommodating differences in sensory experience, sensory processing. 2 is accommodating stimming, which stimming is basically repetitive movements or sounds or other consumption of sensory input that autistic people use to regulate and express ourselves. So that might be something like rocking would be more stereotypical one, although hello, rocking chairs are a pretty old thing. So it's not just autistic people, right? Or things like, rubbing our fingers, or things like making certain sounds repetitively. And just to also be aware that a lot of, people who maybe have a less stereotypical presentation of autism may stim in a way that is less obvious. So people may do things like twirling their hair, or, tapping their fingers in a certain pattern or something like that. That's repetitive and soothing to them, but it may not be as obvious to you. So there's sensory and stemming. We need to accommodate for special interests or intense interests. Autistic people often have things that we are very passionate about and very into. And actually connecting to those things in therapy can be incredibly helpful. We do caution against using those special interests at like withholding them and then using them as a reward, because that could be experienced as manipulative and kind of reactivate that social trauma history that we were talking about. But if we can connect teaching and the treatment to client special interests, that usually makes it much more interesting and much more engaging for autistic folks. And then the 4th S is accommodating need for structure and routine. A lot of autistic folks prefer to have things, or need to have things done in like a relatively predictable, structured way. And we really encourage doing that in a collaborative way, really discussing the whys of, okay, so that we can use our session time efficiently, here's what a suggestion I have in terms of like how we structure our sessions. What do you think about that? Or is there anything that you would not be comfortable with that? So we wanted to have structure and routine, but at least we can probably be pretty flexible in individual therapy about what that looks like. In groups, we might not have as much leeway, but we do want to accommodate that need for structure and routine by sort of being consistent and about structure. And so that's the S. The C is accommodating differences in communication. Autistic folks have a lot of differences in communication. I mentioned before the double empathy problem, which is a very different way of viewing autistic differences in communication than the sort of historical view that autistic people are bad communicators. There's actually more and more evidence that the difficulties in communication mostly come from differences between different neurotypes. And so like autistic people may struggle to understand certain things about non-autistic people's communication, like dropping subtle hints or using certain, metaphors and things like that. Whereas it's also true that non-autistic people struggle to understand autistic people's communication and may, for example, perceive direct statements as being rude because they would, prefer like a subtle hint being dropped or something. So anyway, there's a lot of differences in communication. Autistic people may need longer to process things and come up with an answer. May need have more attention to detail, may have a lot of questions about details about things. Some people may speak less in some situations or not at all in some situations. Some people do have things like apraxia of speech, which is actually a physical issue, not autism per se. That may mean that they don't use mouth words at all. In that case, having other communication options is obviously essential, but we really encourage learning about and adjusting for autistic communication needs and differences. And then the E is for executive functioning, which most people associate with ADHD, not autism. I understand. But actually, the majority of autistic folks do meet criteria for at least an attentive ADHD. And generally, autistic folks do have differences in executive functioning, do need some supports for executive functioning. So that might be things like putting things in writing, having reminders, having things stored in a convenient location where clients can find them if they lost them, things like that, that just sort of basically help kind of keep things on track and support their executive functioning. So that's the model, the ascent, 3 big picture things and 3 things that are more specifically tailoring for the needs of our autistic folks.
Amara, as you're talking, I can't help but hear, just kind of as a general DBT clinician, how much of what we're highlighting, what we're doing is so aligned with what we're already doing in DBT. Like, for example, we're talking about stimming, right? And we're teaching that in our self-soothing skill for distress tolerance. We are teaching people how to stim. Or in our DEAR skill, we're teaching direct language, ask directly. And these executive functioning things, those are beneficial to all clients, even if you're not autistic and you have trouble filing things, figuring out where they are. Well, we as clinicians, we're making it available to our clients to give them the best ability to learn the skills. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there of how much of this is aligned with stuff we're already doing. And it's just all of the pieces, all of the holes where autistic clients really are falling through the cracks that we're seeking to fill with this book.
Thinking about the neuroaffirming targets, it makes me think about a client that I worked with for quite a while in standard DBT, and she had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and that, as a DBT clinician, that was my tunnel vision, and that was what was in the frame. And then I happened to be out, and one of the other clinicians covered for me, and she was like, "Kim, what are you doing? Like, this is an autistic client. Yes, she might meet criteria for BPD, but the autism is a piece that, like, my targets were very neurotypical targets."
Yeah.
And it just was like clicked for me of like, this is why we were literally a strip screw as we were working on the targets that were, because as a DBT clinician, we're just, I'm tunnel visioned on this diagnosis and missing the actual piece that is the barrier. So I really appreciate highlighting that, the neuroaffirming target piece.
And you recognizing that and sharing that is such a beautiful example of neurohumility and opposite action for shame. I mean, you're
Yeah.
this wonderful, well-respected DBT clinician, and you're just openly like, hey, I didn't know what I didn't know, right? Like I was accidentally targeting the things that weren't helpful. And we've all had that. I know Rachel and I have made plenty of mistakes and continue to do so, even though we have thought a lot very deeply about this stuff. So really kind of embracing the DBT fallibility agreement and accepting that we are going to make mistakes and we can still learn and grow and do better. Like those both can happen at the same time. That's a really key dialectic.
And it was a really cool experience to have that conversation with the client also of validating why this isn't working,
Yeah.
essentially, right? Like you're doing
Yeah.
nothing wrong. Like this is why it's not
Right.
working. And so the
Right.
whole piece of it was a really cool experience for all of us involved.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
So what's new in this book? Like what would you say is new to for DBT clinicians that are reading the book? What would they walk away with that is new?
We have several different new skills that we've introduced that, again, are based solely in DBT principles and kind of expand. One of our new skills that's kind of out there, I know LBC put it out last year, is the pleases skill. So based on ABC please, but we've added the second S for balancing sensory input. And it just kind of came from that identification of here's a whole, what makes one dysregulated. I mean, if you think about it, for any of us, overstimulation in one or more sensory areas makes us vulnerable to intense emotion, right? And we actively use and teach sensory input through self-soothing for distress tolerance, or sometimes I explain it to clients that those are more reactive skills. You're already in crisis, you're already dysregulated. Well, wouldn't it make sense on the proactive side to mindfully moderate that if we're over and or understimulated in any of our 8 sensory systems, and we talk more about, we have 8, not 5, is as important to emotion regulation as balancing sleep, making sure we're eating enough, etc. They're all intertwined, right? So that's one of the skills. There's several others. Amara, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, I guess I would say in addition to the new skills, I think just really from the perspective of maybe a typical DBT therapist who specializes more in, not in autistic clients, is really understanding autism from a neuroaffirming lens. I think is going to be really, mind-opening for a lot of folks. And then understanding how can I use that understanding of autism to make this treatment and honestly other treatments that we might be doing. I mean, a lot of DBT therapists don't only do DBT, they might also do exposure and response prevention for OCD, or they might also do, some other treatments. And so just generally understanding how do I adjust what I'm doing to be more effective and affirming for autistic clients. And I won't go into this model because we just talked about that, but we do present that model in quite a bit of detail with a lot of both research and clinical justification and examples. And then we go through and we talk about how to tailor all of the 4 areas of standard DBT, including, plus initial assessment, but initial assessment, individual therapy, group skills training, coaching calls or messaging, and consultation team. And then we also talk about how autism intersects with a lot of other forms of diversity, like age and LGBTQ identities and socioeconomic status and, race and a lot of other things. So I think that there'll be honestly quite a few new things. I mean, some people may know some of this, but I think it'll be quite a bit of new for a lot of people.
And I think it's things that weren't new. Like as I was reading it, things that I've heard, the way that it's packaged and the way that it's conceptualized from a clinical application research perspective, it makes more sense from because a lot of us have the background of DBT, and so
Yeah.
that we have like that part is we get that part. It's this piece that like is showing up in the office, and so
Right.
sort of goes into that next piece of like for clinicians watching this that maybe like me or even maybe not even DBT clinicians and saying how can I do this? And is it safe for me to do this? And outside of getting, professional consultation, what advice would you give me or anyone else like me that is reading this book?
I would say, like, don't be afraid. We have the fallibility agreement. You'll make mistakes. You've made mistakes before. You'll continue to make mistakes. It's part of our agreement. And that's part of holding in context of cultural humility and neurohumility. As long as you do that homework, you learn from autistic folks, you learn about autistic culture from actually autistic people, and you balance that like with any other culture to know that we're not a monolith. We're remaining curious. We need you. We need more clinicians with understanding of this neuroaffirming lens. There's just not enough folks willing to work with autistic folks because they hear that label and they have a lot of stereotypical assumptions.
Yeah.
Chances are you have autistic people on your caseload.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would say most, if not all, DBT clinicians already work with autistic clients because there are so many, especially folks who are maybe less stereotypically presenting, who were not identified in early life. Maybe they even, as an adult, have been trying to understand themselves and getting invalidation, which is not an uncommon thing. So, autistic folks end up with a lot of emotional regulation struggles, partly related to all the trauma that we've gone through, trying to sort of, fit in a world that's not necessarily accommodating our needs. And so you probably have autistic clients already. And I would say, fear is there for a reason. Like fear of making a mistake is there because we might make mistakes, but also in DBT, we already have, as Rachel said, the fallibility agreement. We just accept that that's going to be a thing that happens. And I would say if you do, follow the things that we're suggesting in this book, that you're probably going to be less likely to make those mistakes and more easily able to repair those mistakes. That's one of the real takeaways from cultural and neurohumility, research, is that it makes it more okay to make mistakes and then be able to fix those mistakes because you're not coming in with this, I have to be perfect all the time. It also lowers stress on the clinician, honestly, to accept it, to adopt this perspective that I do not have to know everything and fix everything yesterday. I can do the best I can and learn and grow more right along with my client.
And we're modeling that for our clients.
And
they're seeing this person that I look up to or I work with also can make mistakes, and I can have more confidence in myself in asserting my own needs.
Yeah. And I do believe that in any modality, when we specialize in a modality, we can't get tunnel visioned on that modality, right? Which was where my fallibility came in. It's like, okay, she's presenting with X. So that is the focus, and missing the neurohumility behind X that she's presenting with. Right. And so that piece just really stood out to me because like you said, we all have autistic clients that we see on our caseload. And if we don't yet, we will.
Yeah.
And one of the tools that I meant to talk about a little earlier that I think is really important, I won't go into the details of it, but can also help with the understanding why is something not happening, is the expanded missing link analysis. And one of your questions was what new skill consistently makes clinicians say, I never thought about it this way. And that's where I think that's really important. I mean, when I show that to clinicians and sometimes even clients, giving the language of we don't know what we don't know, but sometimes giving our clients language, giving ourselves language in that way, going through all those additional aspects of what is missing, what's being left out, before arriving at the conclusion that the client is just being willful, because that's kind of a catch-all. And, if we haven't really gone through all possibilities, it can bring on a lot of shame. There's a lot of nuance into what gets in the way. So being able to give those words to our clinicians, to our clients about the why, what's getting in the way that they may not have even considered, is really powerful.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we missed that you wanted to highlight from this? I could talk about this all day, so I want to make sure that we didn't miss any pieces that you wanted to highlight.
I mean, there's so many more
I know.
details, but I would, really invite clinicians to just like dive in, feel free to skim and dive deeper into the parts that call to them. I know sometimes just like, trying to read a whole book about a different way of doing things can feel overwhelming. And I would say, take little bits of it at a time. And do what you can to start with and then gradually do more over time. You don't have to be doing everything perfectly right now.
And a lot of the stuff in there is in alignment with our principles. All is in alignment with principles, but it's also in alignment with universal design. Some of the ways we tailor, you may read and realize, hey, this doesn't just benefit my autistic clients. This benefits everyone. We're all sensory beings. We all have a sensory profile. We all have sensory vulnerabilities. And you may have a client who's not autistic where they're recognizing, oh yeah, I need that accommodation that helps me remain regulated. And so many other of the tools could be applicable beyond just your autistic clients. And I think that is really important, just to see different ways of doing things.
And I do think that that is an important piece for clinicians to hear, is that this, if you don't specialize in autism, that doesn't mean this book isn't helpful for your clinical practice, right? Like, yes, if I may have clinicians that I refer to that they are more adept in this area, and that doesn't mean that this book isn't a book that is going to help my clinical practice, even though that's not an area of my expertise. And so I think that is how, like, I appreciate how it's been written in that way, that it is really clinical. It's like clinically helpful, because you are going to have some clients in your office.
I would also say, even if you don't do DBT therapy, or you do some other kind of therapy, really only the part that's specifically about DBT skills is somewhat unique to DBT. I mean, there's a lot of this, like introducing the neuroaffirming approach to autism, understanding what autistic clients are really like, the assent model, adjusting individual therapy, the intersectionality parts that are very much relevant to a wide range of therapies and honestly types of practice, even including physical medicine. When we work with autistic clients, what do we need to keep in mind? And so I think this is pretty hopefully broadly helpful to quite a few folks working with autistic clients. And I would also say working with family members of autistic clients. Had a conversation with Ellie Lebowitz, who developed the SPACE program, which is a program for parents of anxious children, talking about how this framework could help make that intervention more effective and affirming for anxious autistic folks. And so I think whether you work with autistic people or their families, you'll probably find something in here that will help your work be more effective and affirming.
So in closing, what if every clinician read this book, what would you like what is your hope for treatment 5 years down the road?
My hope is that we're being more effective in targeting what is going on with clients beyond just labeling. We're helping clients understand their neurotype. We're helping clients see, yes, I'm autistic, yes, I'm ADHD, and I'm ADHD, and here is how it impacts my moving through the world. And as clinicians, we're not just seeing that and assigning that the same way. We're not pigeonholing, this is borderline personality. It's we're looking at what is the symptom this client is struggling with. How does it interact with the world around them? How is the world reinforcing it, making it worse? And we're working with the client to find ways to adjust their own ways of being, so they can be more effective in getting to their goals. And we're also helping them accommodate their needs. I think talking a little bit more about, we're recognizing that just because you're autistic doesn't mean you don't have a dissociative disorder. And is that really what's going on? It doesn't mean that you're autistic. Is this rumination because of trauma? Is this rumination solely related to your neurotype and it helps you remain regulated? Is this rumination due to OCD? And allowing that information to help us highlight available skills and tailor our intervention rather than just, you are autistic and therefore this is the intervention. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I really hope that folks will be more embracing of the diversity that walks into their office, and really having more of a neuroaffirming perspective when autistic clients and other folks of different neurotypes show up, and really keeping things focused on what those clients want to accomplish in their lives and how can we share DBT and other therapies with them in a way that is affirming and effective for them, and not in any way invalidating or trying to make them into somebody that they are not. I'd like more positive effectiveness and less harm, and I think that those are the biggest things.
Well, I could sit here and talk about this all day, but I think we've covered some of the highlights of this. Again, thank you both so much. This is a gift to the clinical community. I won't even say to just the DBT community. This is a gift to the clinical community. So I really appreciate both of your humility in writing this book and sharing your experiences as you're writing it and combining that with lived experience, clinical experience, and the research, I think has just made this a fabulous resource for any clinician. So thank you both.